actually. We have not started the book of Hosea yet. We kind of wrapped up Amos. We're bouncing around a little bit, trying to kind of catch it chronologically. And so it might throw you a little bit. That's why we put those printouts. We gave you the big printout of an introduction that had that list in it. And then I put some copies of the list of the order we're going in back there in the back as well. Those may be going by now, but I'm assuming that means everybody grabbed one of those because they were back there. But we're in Hosea chapter 1 today. Hosea chapter 1. I'm going to talk a little bit about Hosea. And Hosea is hard. It's an interesting circumstance, right? Because God literally uses Hosea, literally uses him as a picture of the failed relationship between God and Israel and the difficulties that relationship had. Hosea's name, by the way, simply means salvation or deliverance. And so here's imagery of Hosea, and who is he in the picture? Is he God or is he Israel? Well, I mean, in the analogy itself, he's Jehovah, right? He's the picture of who God is, because God is married, should be. Their covenant relationship between God and Israel should have been. Israel's the one that's adulterating that relationship. And so Hosea is the purity side of this salvation and deliverance. Hosea is the one that depicts God in the picture. And then who depicts Israel as this adulterous relationship between them and God? Gomer, right? His wife. Her name is Gomer. And so you've got this very, to me, very odd way, if you just wanted to kind of put a human thought to it, it may seem quite odd for God to have used Hosea in this fashion and actually give him commands and instructions as to how he was supposed to go and take this wife and let it become a picture for the nation. But that was God's decision to make. And so he becomes a very literal representation of how God continued to love, continued to show loving kindness. I think that's a phrase you'll see repeated throughout the book. God continued to try to encourage and stay and create reconciliation with his people, and then their continued refusal to do that. And ultimately, judgment will come. We probably, and I say probably because there's some speculative thought that has to be added. We've got some references here. Notice the word of the Lord in verse 1. I'll turn my screen on real quick for you. In verse 1 of chapter 1, he said, "The word of the Lord that came unto Hosea, the son of Beri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel." So we've got a time frame, right? We've got a rough time frame, probably 725 or so. I think I'll rephrase I apologize, about 782 to 753. And you've got this period of time in which Hosea's work, probably Hosea's young prophet, because you see him, because he's going to have what here in just a minute in chapter 1? Children, right? And so he's going to see a child come, and then another child come, and they're all actually part of this picture as well in the descriptive names that each of them are given. And so Hosea is probably a younger man. Most likely Amos has kind of gotten older. Remember, he was right before this in the time period, so Amos has been growing older in his work. And then here comes the next prophet on the scene. Here comes Hosea, a younger man, and he becomes a very vivid and literal picture of the challenged relationship between God and Israel. You've gone through different periods of, Syrian and Assyrian aggression towards Israel. Tiglath-Pileser III has finally come on the scene around 745. You kind of start seeing the handwriting on the wall that Israel's going down, and you see those challenges begin to mount even greater than they had before. Israel's about to go through a period where they can't keep a king. Right? You'll go through some years where there might be 3, maybe 4 kings in the same time period. Some kings may only last a month in their reign. And so they're really starting to begin the great descent, if you will, and decline into captivity as Hosea brings his message. Some call Hosea the broken-hearted prophet because he's literally broken-hearted in this challenged relationship with his wife. And he's the picture of God who is broken-hearted because his people, Israel, have refused to honor him and live according to the covenant relationship that they shared. And so you begin to see again the beginnings of the great fall that eventually come to Israel. And really there's a basic theme to the entire prophecy, and that basically illustrates the one-sided relationship. The God who continued to love them, the God who continued to have hopes that they would repent and turn, the God who had desired and wanted reconciliation, who had sent prophet after prophet, messenger after messenger, doing all that God could do to try to fix the relationship between He and His people. But they continued to refuse those efforts. And again, that phrase, loving kindness, you'll see repeated throughout the book. And so just as Hosea's wife, unfaithful to him, Israel becomes or has been unfaithful to God. And you really, depending on which direction you want to look at that imagery, it can kind of become interesting. And we'll do some of that maybe as we walk through the book. So, any other thoughts about introduction, things you might have read about Hosea that you want to share before we move forward into the book itself? Okay, so we've got a person, we've got a time period, we've got a base message of what's happening. Verse 2, the beginning of the word of the Lord by Hosea. And the Lord said to Hosea, Go take unto thee a wife of whoredoms, and children of whoredoms, for the land hath committed great whoredom, departing from the Lord. Now, you'll see some imagery of Hosea in this relationship, but not initially here do we see, you wonder what his reaction when he first hears, right? When he first hears God tell him, go do this. Does this seem normal? Does it seem normal for God, especially, to command a prophet to go and to take a wife from whoredom, from this circumstance? And it seems out of order. But sometimes human wisdom kind of can't see the fullness of what God's really trying to do here. And we'll begin to see it unfold, and they'll have a very literal picture of their challenged relationship. It reminds me a little bit, not exactly, but it reminds me a little bit of the conversation that Nathan has with David, right? David wasn't getting it. David wasn't catching on that he's the problem here. He's got the difficulties. He's taken a woman that didn't belong to him, and the challenges that created, and he's kind of oblivious, willfully oblivious to the realities that he had created. And it takes Nathan coming down and giving him that picture about a man who would take somebody else's, only lamb and like a pet, and the great ruler had all kinds of things that he had at his disposal. But anyway, you get the imagery of how sometimes you got to draw pictures for folks. Sometimes you've got to kind of give it a very visualized understanding. And so that's why God chooses. Hosea, go take a wife from this sort. And so he does, verse 3. He went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, which conceived and bare him a son. Now, here's the thing we need to remember too. She's going to be known, right? This isn't going to be secretive. It's going to be understood by those people that know her and know him and know the whole story of exactly what's happening here. And so I'm sure that initially there's some glaring eyes and wondering thoughts as to what is this? What's going on here? So they have a daughter, Gomer, or rather they have a son. Call his name Jezreel. For yet a little while I will avenge the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu, and will cause to cease the kingdom of the house of Israel. Now, think about this with me for a minute. What happened at Jezreel in relationship to Jehu? If you can go back 2 Kings 10 or so, probably. What actually went on there? Well, let me give you a quick refresher for a second. Let me throw a couple names at you. Does the name Ahab mean anything to you? Does the name Jezebel mean anything to you? Okay, right? And the bad or good people? Not insulting you here, just reminding you. Bad, right? Evil people. And when God decides to bring judgment down, who's He use? Jehu. He uses Jehu to come down and actually destroy the family. Get rid of that family line of Ahab and Jezebel. And it's somewhat interesting because you would think that if God commanded Jehu to go do this, why is he then, in some senses, given a negative feeling for what he had done? Well, let me give you a couple of food for thought reasonings behind that. Let me ask you this. Who wanted to build the temple? David. Who actually got to build it? And why did God tell David that you're not building the temple, I'm going to let Solomon build it? Because David was a man of war, a man of blood. Whose wars were those? God's. Right? God's wars. God's battles. Go take care of the Philistines. Go take care of this nation. And here's my point. Sometimes it's not a matter of whether there was fulfillment of God's commands involved. Sometimes the darkness of the circumstance itself just warrants that some other approach take place in order to go into the next phase. And so David didn't build the temple, even though you could make an argument that he had been fulfilling the commands of God. And he had been so on one side, yeah, Jehu had fulfilled the commands of God. There's a different imagery, though. Let me take you to 2 Kings. I'll just take you one verse. I think we can do it from there. 2 Kings chapter 10 and verse 16. I think this will kind of maybe give us a hint why Jehu maybe is described here as how they're going to avenge the blood of avenge what Jehu had done there in Jezreel. But I want you to notice a phrase in 2 Kings 10 verse 16. Jehu speaking, and he said, "Come with me and see what? See, operative word, my zeal for the Lord." Is it possible to have a zeal for the Lord but for the wrong reasons? Absolutely. It is absolutely possible to have zeal for the Lord for the wrong reasons. My contention here, just from study and doing some reading and thinking back to the history, is that, yes, Jehu had been fulfilling the commands of God, but in the meantime, while he's doing that, he's also advantaging himself in that process. He's also taking advantage of the commands that God had given him for personal gain. God wasn't giving Jehu the commands to go take care of Ahab and Jezebel's family. He wasn't giving him the instructions and commands to take care of these circumstances and situations for his own personal gain. It was about the commands of God. And it gives the appearance sometimes, like in this text, that maybe Jehu had kind of absorbed some of that popularity and some of the personal benefit that might have been coming to him. And he gets rewarded at times by the people, and people get excited about what Jehu's doing. It becomes very personal rather than just fulfilling the commands of God. So, two imageries there as to why this reference to Jezreel happens there in Hosea chapter 1. Sure. Yeah. 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 So through this process, there are times where he's doing what God asked him to do, but not necessarily for all the right purposes and not as dedicated as it might appear sometimes either. Any other thoughts? And I didn't even know whether you walked that path or not when you noticed the name Jezreel here mentioned. Yeah. Yeah. And this first son that Hosea and Gomer will have, Jezreel, will remind folks of this divided allegiance, which is actually what's happening between God and the people as well. Any other thoughts? Call him Jezreel, for yet a little while I will avenge the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu, and will cause the cease of the kingdom of the house of Israel. So we said handwriting on the wall, right? Tiglath-Pileser III starting to build up his power again and his conquest again. It's not going to be long before Israel really starts seeing the pressure and the difficulties that are to come. So then she conceives again, verse 6. And she bears a daughter this time, and God said unto him, call her name that. And good luck with that, right? Loruhamah, maybe. That's the English Paden City version. For I will no more have mercy upon the house of Israel, but I will utterly take them away. Is this a fair statement? God is underappreciated. Would you say that's a fair statement in a general sense? I think that's a fair statement. Yeah. That God has in many, many senses, from the beginning of man's history, God has been underappreciated for who He is, what He's done, how He sustains, how He cares for us, His mercy, all of those. Just throw it all in one large generic kind of thought. And so here this daughter is born. I'll call her this because the mercy has to cease. Even God, in a sense, has a tolerance level. All of us probably have that, right? We have thresholds depending on what it is we're dealing with. And sometimes with some things, our threshold is pretty good, and we can put up with a lot. And then there are other issues that maybe come up, and we're a little shorter, right? We don't quite have the same threshold of ability to handle certain things the same way. And basically, God's saying, "You've hit my threshold. I've shown you mercy. I've shown you kindness. I've been preaching through the prophets over and over and over again, encouraging you to come out of these sins and come out of these behaviors and get back into covenant relationship with me. I've done everything I can do," God says, "to try to give you everything necessary and to have the kind of relationship between them and God that He wanted and desired, but I'm done." The mercy has to stop at some point. And that's a lesson for us. God isn't working exactly in the same way that He was here, because He had a literal physical nation of people He's dealing with at this particular time. But His character doesn't change. And who He is doesn't change. And His power doesn't change. And to influence nations and be involved in how nations move forward or don't move forward. And so we have to take heed to these thoughts that He's sharing here. That He can be kind and merciful and gracious, but broken covenants eventually He's going to deal with, and consequence comes. Yeah. Yeah, it puts him in an interesting circumstance. And especially in his circumstance, and then have to go speak to the people. But it's the lot God has put upon him. Verse 7, I'll have mercy upon the house of Judah, and will save them by the Lord their God, and will not save them by bow, nor by sword, nor by battle, by horses, nor by horsemen. So, I'll ask it maybe first before I give you my food for thought. But why do you think, what's he mean by that? I'm going to show mercy. Your mercy's over, Israel. I'm going to show mercy though upon the house of Judah, and I'm going to do that. And I'm not going to need bows or swords or horsemen or any of that to be able to accomplish it. What's he driving? What's he wanting them to see? Okay, so you're going to see the power of God in relationship to how He's in control of these nations and their circumstances. Put yourself in Israel's shoes for a minute. You're sitting in Israel. Are you favorable towards Judah or not? No. Okay, shake your head this way, right? No, you're not. If you live in Israel, if you're part of that northern kingdom, you're not in favor of Judah. In fact, remember in some of the prophecies we've already studied that God condemns them for their standing outside, borders, and anytime Judah got attacked and kind of in lending their hand towards those who brought challenge. This is a strained relationship. And God just told you, your mercy's over. I'm going to save Judah for a while. I'm going to continue to show mercy to Judah, but it's over for you all. It's a stinging reproach that should have given them pause to think about the fact that how failed their Judah wasn't great, by the way, and eventually they're going to fall, but Israel's going down much, much sooner because God says the mercy has to stop. I'm going to continue with the house of Judah because once in a while they get a good king. Once in a while they get a good king who's trying to get them back towards God and work towards that end. Israel, for the most part, really didn't have that ever in their history. You're fine, yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And so Judah is in a good period in this same moment where Israel's about to be heading down to the captivity situation. Judah's got a king, Hezekiah, who's trying to get the people in the right direction. But God says, and by the way, He says, I don't need a military power to make that happen. You may think Israel, you may think Judah's vulnerable, you may think they're weak, you may think that but I don't need a bow or horsemen or any kind of military power to protect them if I choose to protect them. The power of God's at hand. Yeah. It destroyed them. Yep. And so when she's weaned, she conceives another son. And verse 9 said, Then said God, Call his name Leomai, for ye are not my people, and I will not be your God. Sometimes you wonder whether had they reached a point where this would be as meaningful a statement as it should be. You know, sometimes you can reach a point. I've seen people become so calloused and hardened towards God that this wouldn't change their thinking. God could tell them, I'm no longer your God and you're no longer my people. And it wouldn't faze them because they'd already abandoned that concept anyway. But you would think that His covenant people, that the children that He had brought out of Egypt, the children that He had cared for and watched over and showed mercy to, and when they honored Him, He blessed them, and you would hope that maybe there's this last little piece of conscience in them that would recognize that we're not just about to potentially go into captivity, or we're just not about to have to maybe go into battle when these armies come down against us, but we're creating a circumstance where we're no longer in relationship with God. And you would hope that would affect them. And I can't tell you, just for analogy's sake or for picture's sake, how many times you sit down with somebody across the table and you're begging them to appreciate this fact. That it isn't just about a particular circumstance in their life sometimes. And it's not just about whether they keep coming to church. It's about they're about to destroy their relationship with the Creator. They're about to destroy their covenant relationship with God. And that's serious. That's a sobering circumstance to find yourself in, where all of a sudden now I'm disconnecting from the very God who is loving and who is kind and who is merciful and who can aid us even in the most strained and challenging times. It's a sad place to get when God says, I'm not your God anymore and you're not my people anymore. Who could He say that to now? By the way, who's His people now? The what? The church. Right? So He could still, He could still say that about, especially, in some senses, local assemblies of His people. Judah was still His people too. He was going to save them. But Israel was no longer in His mind. And it's pretty sobering when you think about the magnitude of that. You you would hope that they're getting it. You know what I mean? There's reason behind what God's doing, and with Hosea, and again, and then this is just part of the. As I think about the book as a whole and the prophecy as a whole, is this a prophecy of hope? And I don't think it is. In other words, sometimes prophecies are, if this fixed, then we can reconcile this relationship with God, and this is much darker, where you almost wonder where these are just, you've got an illustration with Hosea, Gomer, and their children that are the express image of what's happened to the people. And this is the reality of your condition, and these are the realities of the consequences of that condition. That seems to be more the picture here with Hosea. As he's just, you would hope that people would see that, but it's all, you know what I mean? I don't know that are they to a point where that's not going to turn them? Is this just evidence to them of the realities? It's hard to tell sometimes. But I don't see this prophecy exactly like others where there's a glimmer. This just seems to be a pretty blatant, blunt depiction of who they are and their failures in relationship to God. But you'd hope some of them would get it anyway. Yeah. 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 Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And that analogy could be very literal here in relationship to this child. And so it's yeah. I mean, again, the pictures are amazing when you think about them. And I'll be honest, my mind didn't necessarily run in that direction, but now that you say it, it makes perfect sense in relationship to that. But we have to appreciate that God is building a very vivid picture of their condition from start to finish, even with the naming of these children and the circumstances that surrounding how these children come to be to begin with. So you notice, yet the number of children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured nor numbered, and it shall come to pass that in the place where it was said unto them, You are not my people, there it shall be said unto them, Ye are the sons of the living God. Then shall the children of Judah and the children of Israel be gathered together, and appoint themselves one head, and they shall come up out of the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. So, there is hope in the message, but not for them, right? Not for that generation. They're going now, and I think there's probably a twofold message here. There's a literal and a pointing forward message here. Eventually they are going to come out of captivity, right? They are in it longer. They're in it much longer. But eventually Judah goes into captivity as well. They're in captivity for roughly 70 years. Judah is. So then when that 70-year period's over, and the people begin to return back to where? Jerusalem initially, right? And though Israel's numbers were like the sand of the sea, they're not really a nation ever again. They may be part of those who came back into the land. They ultimately can be part of who? If you look forward, God's people in the future through Jesus. And I think there's some of that here. And so there's kind of, to me, a twofold message where you've got them literally being allowed to come home back to the land, but there's also a pointing forward to where ultimate coming together in one nation occurs, and that really only happens through Jesus. And so you can see a glimmer of hope for the future, but not for the generations that will come soon after Hosea's prophecy. Yeah. 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 Thoughts or questions? Go ahead, Randy. Yeah. 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 And it's an interesting phrase, right? Because we think of that kind of statement, ye are the sons of the living God. We almost visually think of that as a New Testament kind of phrase that happens through being born again into the family of God. And so that opportunity existed. It was going to exist for them as you eventually come to Jesus, and the opportunities that all men would then have to become sons of the living God and be bound by a covenant, by the way, in like manner. They had a covenant with God as His people, and they had dishonored it. And just because God, through Jesus, offers us an opportunity to come into covenant relationship with Him as His children, don't think for a moment that He somehow doesn't have the same disposition about honoring that covenant. He demands of those who want to be His children, though great opportunity extended through Jesus, but we have maybe even some senses a greater responsibility to honor that covenant that cost His Son His life in order to provide. All right, we just have a couple more minutes, but let's go ahead and jump to chapter 2. We'll get started anyway. We won't make it very far. So he says, say ye unto your brethren, Am I? And to your sisters, Ruhamah. Plead with your mother. Plead, for she is not my wife. Neither am I her husband. Let her therefore put away her whoredoms out of her sight, and her adulteries from between her breasts. Now it's vivid over the next few verses, by the way, but it again now God's just saying it's time to challenge the people. Put away the adultery. Quit breaking the covenant. Your behaviors are unacceptable, and you think about it. Is that not exactly what you would think people would be telling Gomer? Right? That's exactly what you'd be telling Gomer. What are you doing? Why are you behaving this way? Why are you doing and dishonoring your husband in this fashion? Why have you have this circumstance? You had this child. Why have you behaved in such a manner to bring reproach upon yourself, to bring reproach upon your husband, to bring reproach upon your children? Why? And so that's kind of what we would expect when you dealt with her. God says to Israel, "You're Gomer. That's you, and you have created this circumstance where you're not my children any longer. And it's time for you to put all these things away, lest I strip her naked and set her as in the day that she was born, and make her as a wilderness, and set her like a dry land, and slay her with thirst. And I will not have mercy upon her children, for they be the children of whoredoms." Now again, I know that's hard. But here's the thing that I've always tried to understand about narratives like that. Because that sounds like God's doing what? Punishing who? If you just read that casually, you would think that He's punishing who? Children, right? That's inconsistent with what we think about God, right? And so that makes it difficult. Here's what I always strive to understand when I see narratives like this. The punishment is for whom? Who's the accountable ones in this picture? The parents, if you want to continue the analogy, right? But even when the parents are the culpable, responsible, they're the ones who have broken the covenants. They're the ones who have brought this challenge unto the nation. They're the responsible parties when it comes to that. But the problem is especially when you're dealing with a nation, God can't address the people without who else being caught up in that punishment. Yeah, their heirs and their children. There's no, I don't want to say there's no way. I don't want to talk over top of the power of God. But the truth is that as you go through the history of man, you're going to see that. over and over again. We see it today, right? Ask any school teacher, ask any of them, and I promise you, they can't tell you names, not legally, but they know all kinds of pictures they see daily of children who are challenged, not by any fault of their own, not by anything that they ever did, but because of who happened to bring them into this world. And I'm like Hosea, your heart's broken, right? Your heart's broken by that, but you can't fix it all. As much as you'd love to fix, you can't fix it all. And God says, listen, yeah, I'm bringing consequence upon you. You better, if you don't work this and get out of this adulterous circumstance and start honoring me, I'm going to have to come and bring consequence. I can't continue to just bless you irregardless of your behaviors. And your children are going to suffer in this as well. Sometimes you wonder whether even this is kind of you would hope maybe one last jolting moment where maybe they would say to themselves, we're about to cause our own children to suffer because of our choices and our decisions. And how many times maybe we'd like to say the same thing to folks literally today, where you say, don't you realize you're not the only one suffering because of your decisions. You're not the only one challenged by the choices you're making. You're causing consequence to fall upon a lot of others because of those decisions. And that's kind of the message of God here to me. You're going to allow for this to occur because you refuse to honor me. And your children are the ones, in some ways, that are going to suffer the long term. And generations are going to come and go before the people are able to come back, and ultimately before Jesus arrives. Go ahead, Bob. And I think there's imagery there that everything that He had clothed them with and blessed them with is going to be. And when you do that, and for lack of a better, you then expose them for the realities. They may have looked good for a while, but they only looked good because God had been blessing them. He'd been clothing them and feeding them and taking care of them, and make sure they sustain. And He says, as soon as I take that away, you're going to be exposed for what you really are. And now what? Now the consequences come, because now you have to. God's no longer going to take care of you, so now your children are going to suffer because God's not going to just bless you just because He can. That there's a lot of imagery here as it relates to these things. Right. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Did that bell ring? I didn't hear it either. I offer myself. Trying to figure out which clock it's attached to. If I talk for another 10 seconds, I better ring. Let's just stop there. That'll be a good breaking point. Yes, go ahead. Go ahead, Larry. You're fine. Well, they're not the same, but you mean is the name the same? Yeah, I mean they're not. Can't be the same guy. I don't know whether that's what you're asking. But, yeah. I'm Larry. You're catching me trying to think about many things at the same time, which I'm not capable of. If I'm understanding your question, if you're asking me whether the same guy at Numbers is the same guy here in the prophet, that your time periods are. If that was the question, I'm trying to make sure I understand it. But I'll look at it and see if I can make some connections for you. All right, that was the bell.